Have you ever considered how a great empire, once thought to be eternal, just evaporates? It's a strange and fascinating thought. Imagine the Roman legions, the very symbols of order and power, simply packing up their bags and sailing away from the cold, wet shores of Britain. One day, you're part of the civilized world, protected by the might of Rome. The next, you're an afterthought, a distant outpost left to fend for itself. What happens in the vacuum that's left behind? What strange new facts arise from the chaos? And what mysteries remain in the unwritten pages of history? We're about to find out, but before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, let us know where you are in the world and what time it is for you right now in the comments. We're all in this together, a shared journey through the annals of history, so make yourself at home. The story of medieval England doesn't start with kings and castles, but with an ending. It begins with the slow, almost imperceptible withdrawal of the Roman Empire from its northernmost province, a process that started in the late 4th century and culminated around 410 AD. The Roman presence in Britain had been a complex affair for nearly 4 centuries, a blend of military occupation, administrative control, and cultural influence. They built cities like Londinium and Eboracum, connected them with a network of roads that still forms the basis for modern motorways, and brought with them a sophisticated way of life that included public baths, villas, and a monetary economy. The native Celtic peoples, who the Romans called Britons, were slowly Romanized, adopting Latin and Roman customs. But by the late 300s, the empire was under immense pressure. Barbarian tribes were hammering at the borders in Gaul and on the Danube, and the resources to maintain distant outposts were becoming scarce. The legions, the very heart of Roman power, were pulled back to defend the imperial core. This didn't happen all at once, mind you. It was a gradual bleed, a series of troop movements and reassessments that stripped Britain of its protectors, leaving the Romano-British population exposed and vulnerable. Historians still argue whether the withdrawal was a formal, singular event or a prolonged, chaotic collapse. The traditional view holds that the Emperor Honorius sent a letter in 410, telling the Britons to look to your own defenses, effectively severing the formal ties. But was it really that clean? Some scholars suggest that the Romano-British themselves had already begun to push for more local control, seeing the writing on the wall. Either way, the effect was the same. The central authority was gone. Without the Roman military to keep order, the old systems of law and governance quickly began to fray. The villas and towns, once thriving centers of trade, fell into disuse. The Roman roads, without constant maintenance, started to decay. It wasn't an apocalypse, but a slow, creeping decline into a new kind of world. The Romanized elite, those who had become accustomed to a life of relative comfort and stability, were suddenly on their own. The old tribal divisions that Rome had suppressed began to reassert themselves, and local chieftains and warlords rose to fill the power vacuum. This period is often called the Dark Ages for a reason. It's a time of historical obscurity, a frustratingly blurry period where written records are few and far between. This lack of documentation makes it a goldmine for speculation and folklore, though. It's in this era that the legends of King Arthur supposedly have their roots. While the historical Arthur is a subject of endless debate, the idea of a powerful British leader uniting the people to resist invaders fits perfectly into this post-Roman landscape. The Britons, having lost the Roman shield, found themselves threatened by new groups arriving from the sea. These weren't the organized armies of Rome, but raiding parties from what is now modern-day Germany and Denmark, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. These Germanic peoples, often lumped together under the name Anglo-Saxons, were originally invited by the Britons as mercenaries to help fight off threats from the north, such as the Picts and the Scots. This, as you might guess, was a pretty terrible idea. The mercenaries, seeing the weakness of their employers, decided they liked the place and its fertile lands. So, instead of leaving, they started to take it for themselves. Imagine a Romano-British chieftain, let's call him Vortigern, making this deal. He probably thought he was being clever, bringing in some tough warriors to handle his problems. A bit like hiring a bodyguard who then decides he's going to move into your house, wear your clothes, and demand you do all the laundry. It wasn't a single, massive invasion, but a slow, decades-long process of settlement, conflict, and displacement. The Anglo-Saxons, with their different language, religion, and social structures, began to carve out their own kingdoms in the south and east of Britain. The Britons were pushed westward, into the lands we now know as Wales and Cornwall. The name England itself comes from this process, meaning land of the Angles. This was the crucible in which a new nation was forged. It was a brutal, uncertain time, a tapestry woven from strands of old Roman tradition, stubborn Celtic resistance, and the fierce new culture of the Anglo-Saxons. It's a period of great change, with one system crumbling and another entirely new one, slowly rising from the rubble. The story of medieval England is really the story of how that new world came to be, and it all began with an empty chair where a Roman governor used to sit. The Anglo-Saxons, having arrived first as mercenaries and then as opportunistic settlers, didn't just move in and create one big, happy kingdom. That would have been too easy, and history, as we know, rarely takes the easy path. Instead, they carved out a patchwork of smaller, fiercely independent kingdoms across the land. This period, from roughly the 5th to the 9th centuries, is often referred to as the Heptarchy, a term that sounds way more official than the reality of constant warfare and shifting alliances it actually describes. The word itself means 7 kingdoms, which is a bit of a historical simplification, really. At any given moment, there were probably more than 7, all vying for power and prestige. But for the sake of our story, we can focus on the big players: Northumbria in the north, Mercia in the Midlands, and Wessex in the south. Other notable ones included East Anglia, Kent, Sussex, and Essex, each with its own line of kings, its own unique culture, and its own persistent ambitions to become the top dog. Imagine the landscape of this New England. The old Roman roads, while still visible, were likely overgrown and in disrepair. The cities with their grand public buildings were mostly abandoned, their stones and bricks repurposed for new halls and churches. In their place rose new settlements, villages built of timber and thatch, centered around the mead hall of a local lord. Life was a lot more local and a lot more dangerous. The constant threat of raids from rival kingdoms, or from the Britons who were still resisting in the west, meant that alliances were crucial and often short-lived. A king who was a friend one year could easily be a foe the next. The Anglo-Saxon social structure was based on a system of loyalty and obligation. At the top was the king, who was expected to be a successful warrior and a generous lord. Beneath him were the Ealdormen and the Thesians, his noble warriors, who swore an oath of fealty to him in exchange for land and treasure. The majority of the population were Ceorls, free peasant farmers who worked the land, and at the bottom were the slaves. It was a hierarchical world, held together by personal bonds of honor and the promise of protection. One of the most profound changes during this era was the reintroduction of Christianity to the island. Remember how the Romans brought it over? Well, after they left, it largely died out in the Anglo-Saxon parts of Britain, though it held on in Celtic areas like Ireland and Wales. In 597, Pope Gregory the Great sent a monk named Augustine to convert the pagan Anglo-Saxons. He landed in Kent, the kingdom with close ties to the continent, and found a surprisingly receptive audience in King Ethelbert, whose Frankish wife, Bertha, was already a Christian. This wasn't just a spiritual conversion, it was a political one too. Adopting Christianity connected the Anglo-Saxon kings to the wider, more established world of continental Europe. It brought with it a new class of literate monks who could record history and administer law. And it introduced the idea of a king's authority coming not just from his military might, but from God himself. Monasteries became centers of learning, art, and wealth, like the great monastic house at Lindisfarne, and they also became prime targets for future raiders. But we'll get to that later. The political history of the Heptarchy is a cyclical tale of one kingdom's rise to dominance, only to be supplanted by another. For a time, Northumbria was the most powerful, its kings celebrated for their military victories and their promotion of learning. Then Mercia, under a series of powerful kings like Offa, took the lead. Offa, for example, was so influential that he corresponded with Charlemagne, the most powerful ruler in Europe, on equal terms. He even had a huge earthwork built, known as Offa's Dyke, which marked the border with the Welsh kingdoms, and much like a medieval version of a very long and bumpy fence, some of it is still there today, which is pretty neat. Mercia's dominance seemed absolute for a while. It looked like the Midlands might become the permanent site of power in England. But remember how history is a bit of a jokester? Just when one power seems untouchable, a new one rises up, and in this case, that new power came from the south, from the Kingdom of Wessex. The gradual consolidation of power under the kings of Wessex would prove to be a crucial turning point. They slowly, painstakingly, began to absorb their neighbors and consolidate their authority. This wasn't a peaceful process. It was a long, often bloody affair of battles, sieges, and political marriages. By the early 9th century, a king named Egbert had become the overlord of much of southern England. While he didn't rule a unified kingdom in the modern sense, he laid the foundations for his successors to build upon. His grandson, the famous Alfred the Great, a name you've definitely heard before, would take this legacy and run with it. The stage was set for a new kind of England, one that would be forged not just from the constant feuding of petty kings, but from a unified front against a new and terrifying threat that was about to sail in from the North Sea. Imagine the year is 793, and you're a monk on a remote, wind-swept island off the coast of Northumbria. You spend your days copying manuscripts, praying, and tending to the quiet life of your monastery. Your world is one of peace and contemplation, a stark contrast to the warring kingdoms on the mainland. Then, one day, the unthinkable happens. Strange, long ships appear on the horizon, their prows carved into terrifying dragon heads. Men pour out of them, clad in mail, carrying axes and swords. They are unlike anything you have ever seen, fierce, brutal, and they have no respect for your holy sanctuary. This was the scene at the monastery of Lindisfarne, and it marks the official beginning of the Viking Age in England, a period that would shatter the fragile peace of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. For the next 2 centuries, the Vikings would become an inescapable fact of life. They were a diverse group of peoples, primarily from what is now Norway and Denmark, united by their seafaring skills and a desire for wealth, land, and adventure. Their raids were not always large-scale invasions at first. They were swift, brutal smash-and-grab operations, targeting wealthy, unprotected sites like monasteries. The Christian monks, with their ornate golden chalices, jeweled Bibles, and complete lack of armed guards, were, to put it mildly, easy pickings. This wasn't just about plunder, though. The Vikings brought with them a different way of life, a pagan culture that venerated gods like Odin and Thor, and valued martial prowess above all else. This clash of cultures, the peaceful Christian Anglo-Saxons versus the aggressive pagan Norsemen, created a seismic shift in the social and political landscape. At first, the Anglo-Saxon kings struggled to respond. The raids were sporadic and unpredictable. A coastal community might be wiped out one year, only for the raiders to vanish back across the sea the next. They were elusive and frustratingly hard to fight. The problem was, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, despite their growing power, were still largely focused on fighting each other. Remember that heptarchy we talked about? Well, even with Mercia and Wessex vying for dominance, they weren't exactly a unified, cohesive front. The Vikings, on the other hand, were becoming more organized. By the mid-9th century, the raids had escalated into full-blown invasions. The Vikings were no longer just looking for loot. They were looking for land to settle. In 865, a massive force, known to the Anglo-Saxons as the Great Heathen Army, landed in East Anglia. This was no raiding party. This was a war machine. They didn't just raid and leave. They conquered and stayed. The Great Heathen Army swept through the land, a tidal wave of Norse power. They conquered Northumbria, captured the city of York, and established a Viking kingdom there. They overran East Anglia and eventually turned their attention to the powerful kingdom of Mercia. One by one, the great Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell. The kings of Mercia and Northumbria were either killed in battle or forced to submit. It seemed like the entire island was on the verge of becoming a Norse possession, a new Viking dominion. But there was one kingdom that held out, a small beacon of resistance against the storm. That kingdom was Wessex, and its king was a man named Alfred. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely altered the trajectory of English history. If Wessex had fallen, it's highly likely that England as we know it would never have existed. Instead, it might have become a Scandinavian state, with a Norse-derived language and culture. The story of Alfred's struggle against the Vikings is filled with legendary tales, some of which are likely a bit of a stretch, like the famous one about him burning the peasant woman's cakes. But the core of the story is true. He was a brilliant military leader and an even better politician. He didn't just fight the Vikings, he learned from them. He realized that the Anglo-Saxon system of raising an army, which relied on calling up local levies to serve for a short period, was no match for the professional year-round Viking warriors. So, he reformed the army, creating a standing force and building fortified towns, known as burhs, to defend his kingdom. These burhs were a stroke of genius, creating a network of defense that could protect his people and act as a springboard for future offensives. He also took to the seas, building a fleet of longships to fight the Vikings on their own terms. And, of course, he's known for his patronage of learning, translating important Latin texts into Old English, and laying the groundwork for a more educated populace. Alfred was more than just a king. He was a cultural and military innovator who single-handedly saved his kingdom from total annihilation. His struggle against the Viking tide set the stage for the next phase of the story, one that would see his successors complete his work and for the first time unite the various kingdoms under a single crown. It would be a new kind of England, forged in the crucible of war, with a royal line that had risen to the challenge of a new and terrifying enemy. Alfred's legacy was one of survival, but the real unification of England was a family affair, carried on by his children and grandchildren. After Alfred's death, his son, Edward the Elder, continued the fight. He proved to be a formidable military leader, steadily pushing back the Vikings and reclaiming territory. But he didn't just wage war. He built on his father's vision of a strong, centralized kingdom. With the help of his very capable sister, Ethelfled, the Lady of the Mercians, he brought the previously independent kingdom of Mercia under the control of Wessex. Ethelfled, a truly remarkable woman in an age dominated by men, led armies and constructed a network of fortresses, much like her father's burhs, to defend her territory. Together, this brother-sister duo systematically dismantled the Viking power base in the Midlands, a slow, grinding campaign that took decades to complete. The ultimate prize, however, was in the north. The Vikings still controlled a vast swathe of land, an area known as the Danelaw, with its capital at Jorvik, modern-day York. The fight to reclaim this territory fell to Alfred's grandson, a man named Athelstan. Athelstan, who came to the throne in 925, was a true powerhouse. He was a brilliant military commander, a shrewd diplomat, and a king with a grand vision. He spent the early years of his reign consolidating his power, ensuring that all the other Anglo-Saxon rulers in the south acknowledged him as their overlord. Then he turned his attention north. In 927, he successfully conquered Jorvik, effectively ending Viking rule in northern England. This was a monumental achievement, but Athelstan wasn't done yet. He knew that his new kingdom was still fragile, surrounded by powerful and ambitious neighbors. The Welsh, the Scots, and the Vikings in Ireland and the Isle of Man, who were constantly looking for an opportunity to reclaim their lost territory. The moment of truth for Athelstan came in 937 at the Battle of Brunanburh. This battle is a mainstream historical fact that is often overlooked but was absolutely crucial. A grand alliance of Athelstan's enemies, Constantine II, the King of Scotland, Owen, the King of Strathclyde, and Olaf Guthfrithson, the Viking King of Dublin, launched a massive invasion. They intended to crush Athelstan and partition his new kingdom. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes the battle as a huge, bloody affair, a testament to the savagery of medieval warfare. Athelstan, leading his forces personally, met them head-on and achieved a decisive victory. The allied kings were defeated, and their armies were shattered. Brunanburh wasn't just a win, it was a statement. It cemented Athelstan's position as the most powerful ruler in the British Isles. Following his victory, Athelstan styled himself as Rex Totius Britanniae, or King of all Britain. While that might have been a bit of a stretch, the Scots and Welsh were not exactly bowing down in submission. It reflected his ambition and the new reality of the political landscape. He was the first ruler to truly govern the entire territory that we now call England. His reign marked the end of the Heptarchy and the beginning of a unified English kingdom. He established a sophisticated court, created a single currency for the entire kingdom, and forged strong diplomatic ties with rulers on the European continent, even marrying his sisters to various European princes. He was a king of international standing, and his kingdom was recognized as a major player on the European stage. The period following Athelstan's reign saw a few minor setbacks, but the momentum of a unified England was too strong to be reversed. His successors, particularly Edgar the Peaceful, continued to strengthen the kingdom, codifying laws and creating a stable, well-administered state. This was a golden age for Anglo-Saxon England, a period of relative peace and prosperity. The country was known for its wealth and its sophisticated culture, particularly its beautiful illuminated manuscripts and fine metalwork. This period of stability, however, was not destined to last. The Vikings, who had been pushed back, were not gone for good. A new wave of Danish raiders began to appear on the horizon, and their targets weren't just monasteries this time. They were after a much bigger prize, the throne of England itself. But before that, we have to talk about how this unified kingdom, forged in blood and iron, would eventually find itself under the rule of a Danish king, a strange twist of fate that nobody could have predicted. A unified England, painstakingly forged over decades of conflict, was not destined for lasting peace. In the late 10th and early 11th centuries, a new wave of Viking attacks began, but these were different. They weren't just raids for plunder, they were a coordinated political effort by the kings of Denmark to conquer the entire island. The English monarchy, now a single entity, struggled to cope. The king at the time, a man named Ethelred the Unready, proved to be a particularly poor ruler, and his nickname, which actually means ill-advised, was well earned. His solution to the Viking threat was to pay them off with a tax known as the Danegeld. It was an attempt to buy peace, but it only made the Vikings see England as a cash cow ripe for the milking. The more he paid, the more they came back for. Eventually, his policies escalated into a catastrophic act of state-sponsored violence. In 2002, Ethelred ordered the massacre of all Danes living in England, a horrific event known as the St. Brice's Day Massacre. This didn't solve his problems. It only provoked a furious and powerful response. The response came from Svein Forkbeard, the king of Denmark, whose sister was believed to have been among the victims of the massacre. He launched a full-scale invasion, and by 1013 he had conquered England and forced Ethelred to flee into exile. But Swein's triumph was short-lived. He died just 5 weeks later, leaving his son Nut to continue the fight. This is a crucial historical fact. The English had a king in exile and a Danish invader with a claim to the throne, and the next few years were a messy, brutal struggle for power. Nut faced off against Ethelred's son, Edmund Ironside, a formidable warrior who rallied the English forces. The war was a bloody affair, with both sides trading blows and holding on fiercely to their claims. It only ended when Edmund died under suspicious circumstances in 1016, leaving Cnut as the undisputed ruler of England. Cnut's reign, which lasted from 1016 to 1035, is a fascinating and often surprising chapter in English history. When you think of a Viking conqueror, you might imagine a brutal tyrant who ruled with an iron fist. But Cnut was a pragmatist, a surprisingly effective and shrewd statesman. He didn't try to wipe out the Anglo-Saxon culture, he embraced it. He married Emma of Normandy, the widow of the exiled Ethelred, which helped to legitimize his rule and forge a connection with the Old English royal line. He blended the old Anglo-Saxon laws with new Danish customs, creating a stable and well-ordered kingdom. He divided England into 4 earldoms, East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex, and placed loyal men, both English and Danish, in charge. He even became a devout Christian, making a pilgrimage to Rome and donating generously to the church. He was a king who understood that true power came from stability, not just from conquest. Cnut's ambitions, however, extended far beyond England. He inherited the throne of Denmark and conquered Norway, creating a vast North Sea empire that stretched from the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the rolling hills of Wessex. He was, for a time, the most powerful ruler in northern Europe. His story is filled with interesting anecdotes, like the famous tale of him commanding the tide to turn back. While this story is likely a later embellishment, it perfectly illustrates his character. He was a wise king who understood that his power had limits and that he was subject to a higher power, in this case, God. He wasn't a fool who believed he could control nature. He was a leader who used the moment as a lesson for his sycophantic courtiers.
But like many empires built by a single powerful figure, Knut's North Sea Empire did not long outlive him. Upon his death, his sons fought over his inheritance, and the empire quickly disintegrated. The English throne passed to his sons, but their reigns were short and plagued by instability. The stage was set for the return of the old Anglo-Saxon dynasty, a chance for the exiled royal line to reclaim its rightful place.
This period of turmoil and competing claims would lead directly to the final dramatic act of the Anglo-Saxon era, one that would bring us to the brink of a new age where the throne of England would be up for grabs, not just between two rival houses, but between three ambitious and powerful men. The death of Cnut marked the beginning of the end for the Anglo-Saxon kingdom, even as it appeared to be returning to its roots.
With Knut's death and the subsequent disintegration of his North Sea Empire, the Anglo-Saxon line had a chance to reclaim the throne. After the brief and tumultuous reigns of Knut's sons, the English nobles, eager for stability, invited Edward the Confessor, the son of the previously deposed Ethelred the Unready, and Emma of Normandy, to return from his exile in Normandy. He was crowned king in 1042. Edward's reign, which lasted until 1066, is a strange and complex period. He was known for his piety, which earned him the moniker the Confessor, and he spent a significant amount of his time building Westminster Abbey, an architectural marvel that still stands today. But for all his piety and devotion, he was a surprisingly weak and ineffectual ruler when it came to the day-to-day business of governing.
Edward had spent much of his life in Normandy, a region of France that had been settled by Vikings and ruled by a powerful duke. He grew up speaking French, surrounded by Norman nobles, and his court in England was filled with his Norman friends and advisors. This created a lot of resentment among the powerful English earls, particularly Godwin, Earl of Wessex, who was one of the most powerful men in the kingdom, effectively a kingmaker. The tension between the native English nobility and the king's Norman favorites created a deep-seated political divide that would prove to be a major factor in the coming crisis. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely sets the stage for the dramatic events of 1066. Edward's reliance on his Norman friends and his subsequent conflict with the powerful Godwin family weakened the Anglo-Saxon state from within. The biggest problem of Edward's reign, however, was his lack of an heir. He and his wife, Edith, Godwin's daughter, were childless. This meant that as he grew older, the question of succession became a central and increasingly tense issue. Edward, with his Norman sympathies, may have promised the throne to his cousin William, Duke of Normandy. In the 1050s, he supposedly promised William the throne in exchange for military support, and later he sent Harold Godwinson, Godwin's son, to Normandy, where Harold was forced to swear an oath of fealty to William and acknowledge his claim. However, the English tradition of succession wasn't as straightforward as primogeniture, the eldest son inheriting. The Witan, a council of powerful nobles and churchmen, had the right to choose the next king, usually from within the royal family. A Norman duke with no royal blood wasn't exactly a traditional choice. As Edward's health failed, the political maneuvering reached a fever pitch. On his deathbed in January 1066, he allegedly designated Harold Godwinson, the most powerful and influential of the English nobles, as his successor. The Witan quickly confirmed this choice, and Harold was crowned king. This seemed like a reasonable, if not inevitable, choice. Harold was a proven military leader, a powerful administrator, and he had the support of the English nobles. But there was a small problem, or rather, two big problems. William of Normandy, with his supposed promise from Edward and Harold's oath of fealty, immediately declared Harold a perjurer and a usurper. He began to prepare for a massive invasion, but there was a third contender for the throne. Harold Hardrada, the fearsome king of Norway, also claimed the English throne, believing he had a legitimate claim through an earlier agreement between Knut's descendants. This is where the story gets really interesting. England now had three claimants to the throne, each with a plausible, if not entirely legitimate, claim. There was Harold Godwinson, the crowned king with the support of the English nobles, William of Normandy, with his promise and his oath, and Harold Hardrada, the Viking king, with a claim and a massive army. The year 1066, a date etched into the memory of every English schoolchild, was about to begin with a bang. Harold Godwinson was about to face a nightmare scenario, invasions from two different directions, and he had to be ready to fight them both. The stage was set for a year that would forever alter the course of English history, a year that saw the end of the Anglo-Saxon world and the dawn of a new era. Harold Godwinson, now King of England, had a very bad year. The year 1066 is probably the most famous date in English history, and for good reason. It was a non-stop, high-stakes drama. Harold knew that his claim to the throne was precarious. He had two powerful rivals, William, Duke of Normandy, and Harold Hardrada, the Viking king of Norway. To make matters worse, his own brother, Tostig Godwinson, had been exiled and had allied himself with Harold Hardrada. A family feud and a continental invasion? That's a pretty heavy plate to start with. Harold spent the early months of 1066 waiting. He knew William was preparing a massive invasion fleet on the coast of Normandy, but he couldn't just sit there. He had to keep his army, a mix of professional warriors and local levies, ready to fight at a moment's notice. This was a logistical nightmare. The harvest season was approaching, and soldiers needed to get back to their farms. So, in early September, believing the invasion was unlikely to happen due to unfavorable winds, Harold reluctantly disbanded a large portion of his army. And that's when the other shoe dropped. Just as Harold was letting his guard down, the invasion came from the north. Harold Hardrada and Tostig Godwinson, leading a huge Viking fleet, landed in Northumbria. They quickly defeated the local earls at the Battle of Fulford Gate and captured the city of York. When the news reached Harold in the south, he had to act fast. He quickly reassembled his forces and, in a remarkable feat of medieval military logistics, marched his army 185 miles north in just 5 days. It was an astonishing speed march, a testament to Harold's leadership and the training of his troops. He caught the Vikings completely by surprise. On September 25th, 1066, at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold's army clashed with the Viking forces. The battle was a bloody, hard-fought affair, but the element of surprise was on Harold's side. The Vikings, who had left their armor on their ships, were caught unawares. After a fierce fight, Harold's army was victorious. Harold Hardrada was killed, and Tostig Godwinson was also slain. Harold had won a decisive victory, and it seemed like the English kingdom was safe. He had defeated one of the most fearsome warriors of the age, and had crushed the Viking threat once and for all. He could finally relax, right? Wrong.
2 days later, on September 27th, the wind changed in the English Channel. William of Normandy, with his vast fleet of ships and an army of Norman, Breton, and Flemish knights, finally set sail. He landed in Sussex, on the south coast of England, on September 28th. He built a castle and waited. When Harold heard the news, he was faced with an impossible choice. His army was exhausted from its lightning-fast march and the brutal battle it had just fought. They were battered, weary, and in no condition to face a fresh, well-equipped army. But he couldn't let William rampage through his kingdom unopposed. He had to go south, and he had to go now. Harold and his depleted army made another forced march, this time south. They arrived near the town of Hastings on October 13th, and Harold positioned his forces on a hill known as Senlac Hill. He hoped to force William to attack him on his chosen ground. On October 14th, 1066, the Battle of Hastings began. The Anglo-Saxon army formed a tight shield wall, a near impenetrable defensive formation that repelled wave after wave of Norman cavalry charges. The battle raged all day, a brutal back-and-forth struggle. The Normans feigned retreats, a classic tactic, to draw the Anglo-Saxons out of their defensive formation. It worked. The shield wall broke. As the day wore on, the advantage slowly shifted to the Normans. The battle culminated with the death of Harold Godwinson, who was likely killed by an arrow to the eye, a detail famously depicted in the Bayeux Tapestry. With their king dead, the Anglo-Saxon army finally broke and fled. William had won. He was now William the Conqueror, and his victory at Hastings marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon era and the beginning of a new one. This single day changed the language, the law, and the entire culture of England forever. With Harold Godwinson dead on Senlac Hill and his army scattered, William of Normandy was the undisputed victor of the Battle of Hastings. But his conquest of England was far from complete. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, though defeated, still held power, and London had not yet submitted. William knew he had to act decisively to secure his new kingdom. He didn't just march straight to the capital. Instead, he took a more strategic approach, moving slowly through the surrounding countryside, sacking towns and villages as he went. This was a classic medieval strategy. Show them the consequences of resistance. He wanted to break the will of the English to fight. The English nobles and churchmen, seeing the destruction and realizing they had no other viable candidate for the throne, finally submitted to him at Berkhamsted. On Christmas Day, 1066, a little over 2 months after the Battle of Hastings, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. This was the moment the Norman Conquest became a reality. The immediate aftermath of the conquest was a period of consolidation, and William proved to be a masterful, if ruthless, administrator. His first priority was to replace the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with his own loyal followers. He confiscated the lands of the English earls who had fought against him and distributed them to his Norman barons, creating a new ruling class that owed everything to him. This wasn't a subtle process. It was a complete overhaul of the landowning structure of England. The Anglo-Saxon magnates were dispossessed, exiled, or killed, and their wealth and power were transferred to a new foreign elite. This act, known as the Norman yoke, was a source of deep resentment for centuries, and historians still debate the extent to which it was a total social and cultural destruction or a more gradual assimilation. But for the average Anglo-Saxon, it must have felt like a complete and utter catastrophe. The initial years of William's reign were not peaceful. Rebellions broke out across the country, particularly in the north, where the Anglo-Saxon spirit of resistance was strongest. William responded with characteristic brutality. He launched a campaign known as the Harrying of the North in 1069 to 1070. This was a scorched earth policy designed to crush all opposition. His army laid waste to vast swaths of land, burning villages, destroying crops, and killing livestock. The devastation was so complete that for decades, the north of England was a desolate and depopulated wasteland. It was a horrific act of collective punishment, but it worked. The rebellions ceased, and the North remained cowed for a generation. It was a powerful and terrifying demonstration of William's absolute authority. To cement his control and ensure that his new kingdom was well administered and taxed, William ordered the creation of the Domesday Book in 1086. This was a comprehensive survey of the entire country, a meticulous record of every manor, village, and holding. It recorded who owned what their land was worth, how many peasants lived there, and what resources were available. It was a groundbreaking administrative achievement, a total census of his new kingdom's wealth. The name Domesday comes from the Anglo-Saxons themselves, who saw the survey as a final judgment, like the last judgment in the Bible, because its findings were unalterable. It was a testament to William's meticulous attention to detail and his unshakable desire for control. With the Domesday Book, William had a complete picture of his kingdom's resources, allowing him to tax it more effectively and manage his new feudal system. The Norman Conquest, therefore, was not just a change of monarch. It was a complete societal revolution. The Anglo-Saxon language was replaced as the language of the court by French, though it survived and evolved among the common people, eventually blending with French to create Middle English. The old Anglo-Saxon feudal system, which was based on personal loyalty, was replaced with a much more rigid and hierarchical Norman system, a classic mainstream historical fact. The Normans built great stone castles, like the Tower of London, not just as homes for the nobility, but as symbols of their power and tools of control. William the Conqueror had not just won a battle. He had fundamentally changed the very fabric of England, creating a new Anglo-Norman kingdom that would forever be a part of both the British Isles and the European continent. With William the Conqueror's victory and his subsequent coronation, a new era was born, but it was far from a peaceful one for the defeated Anglo-Saxons. The period after 1066 is often referred to by historians as the Norman Yoke, a phrase that captures the harsh reality of a foreign ruling class imposing its will on the native population.
William had won the throne, but now he had to hold it, and that meant subjugating a people who were not exactly thrilled about their new French-speaking overlords. The old Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was largely wiped out. The earls and thanes who had owned the land for generations were dispossessed, their lands and titles given to William's Norman, Breton, and Flemish followers. This wasn't a subtle change, it was a wholesale transfer of wealth and power. The new Norman lords didn't just take over, they built a physical manifestation of their authority, the castle. Before 1066, castles were rare in England. Anglo-Saxon strongholds were more like fortified manors or burhs, often built of wood and earth. The Normans, however, brought with them the tradition of castle building. At first, these were simple motte and bailey castles, a huge mound of earth, the motte, topped with a wooden tower and surrounded by a walled courtyard, the bailey.
These were quick to build and a perfect way to control a rebellious population. A small garrison could hold a castle and dominate the surrounding countryside, a constant reminder of who was in charge. Later, As the Normans consolidated their power, these wooden structures were replaced by massive stone keeps, like the White Tower in London, which still stands today. These weren't just homes for the nobility, they were military fortresses and symbols of Norman dominance. The new feudal system was another key component of the Norman yoke. The Anglo-Saxon system had been based on oaths of personal loyalty between a lord and his man, but the Norman system was much more rigid and structured. At the top was the king, who owned all the land. He granted large chunks of land to his most powerful barons, known as tenants-in-chief. In return, these barons swore an oath of fealty and provided the king with military service, knights and soldiers for his army, and taxes. The barons, in turn, divided their land among their own knights, who owed them military service. At the very bottom of this pyramid were the villeins and serfs, the vast majority of the population, who were tied to the land they worked. They were not slaves, but they were not free either. They couldn't leave their lord's manor without permission, and they had to work the lord's land for free. It was a system that ensured the Normans had a constant supply of soldiers, taxes, and labor, while the English peasantry remained subjugated. This new system, combined with a foreign language and culture, created a deep divide between the rulers and the ruled. The Norman nobility spoke French, ate French food, and brought with them a new legal system. The English, meanwhile, continued to speak their own language, which, as a result of this foreign influence, began to evolve into Middle English. This linguistic and cultural divide persisted for centuries, a constant reminder of the conquest. There's a light joke hidden in this, you know. Think about our modern language. The words for animals like cow, sheep, and pig are Anglo-Saxon, from the people who tended them in the fields. But the words for their meat, beef, mutton, and pork are French, from the Normans who ate them at the dinner table. It's a funny, slightly sad little linguistic fossil of a conquered people. The Normans also brought with them a new legal system that was more codified and centralized than the Anglo-Saxon one. They created a system of royal courts that gradually took power away from the local courts, and they introduced the concept of the royal writ, a written order from the king. While this eventually led to the development of English common law, in its early stages it was another tool of control. The Norman yoke, therefore, wasn't just about a change of kings. It was a fundamental shift in the entire social, economic, and legal structure of the country. It was a system designed to maintain power and to ensure that the new ruling class remained on top. This is the period where we really see the fusion of cultures begin, a slow, painful, and often brutal process that would shape England for centuries to come. Historians still argue whether the Norman conquest was a good thing or a bad thing for England, but one thing is for sure. It was a defining moment that set the stage for everything that was to follow. The Norman conquest had firmly established the new dynasty, but the peace it brought was a fragile thing, held together largely by the iron will of William the Conqueror himself. When William died in 1087, the succession was immediately thrown into chaos. His kingdom, which stretched across England and Normandy, was split between his two eldest sons. Robert Curthose, the eldest, inherited the Duchy of Normandy, while William Rufus became King of England. This split created an immediate problem. Many barons had landholdings on both sides of the Channel, and they found themselves in the impossible position of having to serve two different masters. A rebellion broke out, led by those who wanted to unite England and Normandy under one ruler, Robert. William Rufus, however, proved to be a brutal but effective military commander and managed to crush the rebellion, securing his throne. William Rufus's reign, from 1087 to 1100, was a period of high drama and conflict. He was a ruthless and deeply unpopular king, known for his greed and his constant conflicts with the church. He died in a hunting accident in the New Forest, an event that is still shrouded in mystery. Some historians still argue whether it was truly an accident or a political assassination. The most likely beneficiary of his death, his younger brother Henry, just happened to be on the hunting trip with him.
Henry seized the moment and with incredible speed rode to Winchester, where the royal treasury was kept, and then to Westminster, where he was crowned King Henry III. His older brother Robert was still away on the First Crusade and was too slow to react. Henry III, who ruled from 1100 to 1135, was a very different kind of king. He was known as the Lion of Justice and was a great administrator. He realized that the new Norman ruling class had to make peace with the Anglo-Saxon population if his kingdom was to be truly stable. He married Matilda, a Scottish princess, who was a direct descendant of the old Anglo-Saxon kings, which was a brilliant political move.
This marriage helped to legitimize his rule in the eyes of the native population and created a powerful symbol of unity. He also continued his father's work in strengthening the central government, creating a more effective system of justice and taxation. He successfully defeated his brother Robert and reunited England and Normandy under a single ruler, just as his barons had wanted, but with a different king at the helm. But once again, the issue of succession would rear its ugly head. Henry's only legitimate son, William Adelin, tragically drowned in a shipwreck in 1120. With no male heir, Henry was forced to declare his daughter, Matilda, as his successor. This was a radical idea for the time. A woman ruler was unheard of in England. He made his barons and bishops swear an oath to support her, but the idea of a queen regnant was deeply unpopular.
When Henry died in 1135, the powerful barons broke their oath and quickly installed Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois, as king. Stephen was a popular choice, a kind and charming man, but he was no ruler. He was weak and indecisive, and he quickly lost control of the country. This led to a period of widespread lawlessness and civil war that would become known as the Anarchy.
This is a classic historical debate. Was Stephen simply an incompetent king, or was the period so chaotic because of the fundamental issue of a female ruler? Historians still argue about this. Matilda, with the support of her half-brother Robert, Earl of Gloucester, launched an invasion to claim her rightful throne. The civil war that followed, from 1135 to 1153, was a brutal and destructive affair. The land was ravaged by fighting, and the king's authority collapsed. The chronicler who wrote about this time famously said, "Christ and his saints slept." Barons built their own unlicensed castles and terrorized the local populations. It was a complete breakdown of law and order, and it was the direct result of a lack of a clear line of succession. The kingdom that William the Conqueror had so meticulously built was falling apart, and it would take a new kind of ruler to put it back together again. The end of this period of chaos would usher in a new dynasty, one that would change the face of England yet again. The period of civil war and lawlessness that gripped England from 1135 to 1153, known as the Anarchy, finally came to an end not through a decisive battle, but through a negotiated peace. King Stephen, a good man but an ineffective ruler, had simply lost control. The country was in a state of chaos, with rival barons building their own castles and waging private wars, and Empress Matilda's forces controlling large parts of the West.
A solution was needed, and it came from an unexpected quarter. Matilda's son Henry, who had been quietly growing up in Anjou, a powerful region in France. Henry was a very different man from his grandfather, Henry III, or his great-uncle Stephen. He was dynamic, energetic, and incredibly ambitious. By the time he was a teenager, he was already showing a keen talent for leadership and administration. In 1153, Henry invaded England and, after a brief campaign, met with Stephen. The two men, tired of the endless conflict, came to an agreement. Stephen would remain king for the rest of his life, but he would recognize Henry as his heir. When Stephen died a year later, in 1154, Henry was crowned King of England, ushering in a new and powerful dynasty, the Angevins, named after his family's French seat in Anjou. Henry II's reign, from 1154 to 1189, was a period of incredible change and expansion, and he would go on to be one of England's most important and influential monarchs. He was a man of immense energy, a workaholic who was constantly on the move, administering justice, campaigning in his vast territories, and managing his sprawling family. Henry's empire was unlike anything England had ever seen. Through inheritance and marriage, he controlled a vast amount of land, not just in England, but across western France, including Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and Aquitaine. This collection of lands is known as the Angevin Empire. He was a more powerful ruler on the continent than the King of France himself. He spent much of his reign trying to manage and defend this sprawling and diverse territory, which stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. But he also focused on reforming England itself. His biggest challenge was restoring law and order after the anarchy. He dismantled the unlicensed castles that the barons had built and reasserted the authority of the crown. He created a new system of justice, a crucial mainstream historical fact that still influences our legal system today. He introduced a system of traveling royal judges who heard cases in local courts, a practice that ensured a more consistent application of the law across the kingdom. He also made it easier for people to bring their cases to the royal courts, which was a huge step forward for justice. He also reformed the military. He introduced a tax called scutage, which allowed his barons to pay a fee instead of providing military service. This money enabled Henry to hire professional mercenaries, which made his army more reliable and loyal to him personally, rather than to the local barons. He also reorganized the army, creating a system that could quickly raise a large fighting force when needed. This gave him a level of military control that his predecessors had only dreamed of. But Henry's greatest challenge was not from his barons or his foreign enemies. It was from the church. The church, like the feudal nobility, had become incredibly powerful during the anarchy, and it ran its own courts, which often had jurisdiction over cases that Henry believed should be in the royal courts. His conflict with the Archbishop of Canterbury, his old friend Thomas Becket, would become a defining moment of his reign, a bitter and personal struggle between the power of the state and the power of the church. This conflict would end in a shocking act of violence that would forever stain Henry's reputation and shape the relationship between the crown and the church for centuries to come. The anarchy was over, but the troubles for the new Angevin king were only just beginning. Henry II's reign, which began with such promise after the chaos of the anarchy, was not without its own deep-seated conflicts. His greatest challenge came not from a rebellious baron or a foreign king, but from his former friend, Thomas Becket. The story of their relationship is a classic tragedy of power and ambition. Thomas Becket was a brilliant, charismatic man who had risen through the ranks of Henry's administration. He was Henry's closest friend and chancellor, a loyal servant who was just as ruthless and efficient as the king himself. Henry trusted him completely, and in 1162, when the Archbishop of Canterbury died, Henry saw an opportunity to consolidate his power over the church. He had Becket appointed to the position,
believing that his loyal friend would help him bring the independent and wealthy English church to heel. This, as you can probably guess, was a spectacular miscalculation.
The moment Becket became archbishop, everything changed. He underwent a profound spiritual transformation, giving up his lavish lifestyle and adopting the ascetic habits of a devout monk. He became an unyielding defender of the church's rights and privileges, and he immediately came into conflict with Henry over the issue of criminous clerks, churchmen who had committed crimes. Under the law of the time, clergymen could only be tried in church courts, which rarely imposed harsh punishments.
Henry wanted them to be tried in royal courts, a demand that Becket saw as a direct attack on the church's autonomy. Their conflict, which had started as a political disagreement, quickly became a bitter, personal war of wills. This escalating feud forced Becket into exile in France for 6 years, where he continued to defy the king. Their back and forth was a masterclass in medieval political brinkmanship. Becket excommunicated Henry's key advisors, while Henry retaliated by seizing Becket's lands and persecuting his family. A temporary peace was finally brokered, and Becket returned to England in 1170. But the peace was short-lived. Becket immediately excommunicated several bishops who had sided with Henry. When news of this reached the king, who was in Normandy at the time, he flew into a rage. In a moment of uncontrolled fury, he supposedly cried out, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" A group of 4 of his knights, perhaps seeking to curry favor with the king, took his words literally. They crossed the Channel, rode to Canterbury Cathedral, and confronted Becket.
On December 29th, 1170, the knights burst into the cathedral during Vespers. They demanded that Becket lift the excommunications and submit to the king. Becket refused, and the knights, in a shocking act of violence, murdered him on the altar steps. The brutality of the act horrified the Christian world. Becket was immediately hailed as a martyr, and his tomb at Canterbury became a pilgrimage site. Henry, realizing the enormity of his mistake, was forced to do public penance.
He walked barefoot to Canterbury Cathedral and allowed himself to be scourged by the monks. This act of public humiliation was a powerful testament to the power of the Church. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely altered the relationship between the Crown and the Church. Henry was forced to back down on his reforms and acknowledge the Church's authority.
The murder of Thomas Becket was a low point for Henry II, but it wasn't his only problem. His last years were plagued by constant rebellions from his own sons, who were supported by their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and Henry's greatest rival, the King of France. Henry's ambitious sons, Richard, Geoffrey, and John, all wanted a piece of their father's empire, and they were willing to wage war against him to get it.
This family drama, which was part soap opera and part military campaign, would ultimately lead to Henry's death in 1189. The great Angevin empire he had built was a powder keg, and his most famous son, Richard the Lionheart, was about to light the fuse. The stage was set for a new kind of kingship, one defined by chivalry, military glory, and the vast, expensive pursuit of a holy war. Henry II's death in 1189 brought his eldest surviving son, Richard I, to the throne. Richard, however, was a very different kind of king from his father. While Henry had been a workaholic administrator, Richard was a charismatic, legendary warrior, and he saw England less as a home and more as a source of revenue to fund his true passion, the Crusades. His moniker, the Lionheart, wasn't just a clever nickname. It was a testament to his reputation for bravery and military genius on the battlefield. From the moment he was crowned, his focus was not on governing his kingdom, but on preparing for the Third Crusade, which had been called to recapture Jerusalem from the Muslim leader Saladin. Richard spent a little over 6 months in England during his entire 10-year reign. The rest of the time was spent either on crusade or in his French territories. His quest to liberate the Holy Land was a massive, expensive undertaking. To finance it, he ruthlessly exploited England's resources. He sold off royal lands, sold titles and offices, and imposed a heavy tax known as the Saladin tithe. He famously quipped that he would sell London if he could find a buyer. His priorities were clear. The Holy War came first, and England's well-being was a distant second. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined his reign from a domestic perspective. He was a king who was adored by his people for his chivalry and his heroic deeds abroad, but his neglect of England had a profound and lasting impact. The Third Crusade itself was a grand, epic adventure. Richard, leading a combined force of English and French knights, was a formidable presence. He was a brilliant tactician and a fearsome warrior, and he won a series of stunning victories, most notably at the Battle of Arsuf, where his army completely defeated Saladin's forces. He recaptured the coastal city of Acre, and his legend grew across both Europe and the Middle East. However, despite his military successes, he was unable to retake Jerusalem. He came close, but political divisions within the Crusader army and the logistical challenges of a long campaign proved to be insurmountable. He eventually negotiated a truce with Saladin, which allowed Christian pilgrims access to the Holy City, a pragmatic solution that was seen as a major success for its time, even if it fell short of the ultimate goal. On his way back to England, Richard's bad luck struck. His ship was wrecked, and he was captured by his political rival, Leopold V, Duke of Austria, who handed him over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry II. Richard was held for ransom, and it was a king's ransom indeed. To secure his release, England was forced to pay a colossal sum of 150,000 marks, which was an enormous amount of money, equivalent to about 2 years of royal income. To raise the money, the English people were once again taxed heavily, and the church melted down its treasures. The country groaned under the burden, but the legend of their hero king was enough to make them pay. He was finally released in 1194 and returned to England, only to stay for a few months before heading back to his French lands to fight against his rival Philip II of France, who had been causing trouble while he was away. Richard's reign, therefore, was a time of immense military glory, but also massive financial strain for England. He was an absent king who cared more about his French territories and his crusading ambitions than he did about the day-to-day governance of England. His neglect of the kingdom would have a profound and lasting impact on the next reign. With Richard gone, the day-to-day administration was left to his ministers, and it created a power vacuum that would be exploited by his younger, much less heroic brother, John. The stage was set for a disastrous reign, one that would see the kingdom brought to the brink of collapse and would lead to one of the most important documents in all of English history. Richard the Lionheart was a great warrior, but he was a terrible king for England. Richard the Lionheart's reign, though celebrated for its chivalry and martial glory, left England in a precarious position. The kingdom had been bled dry to pay for his crusades and his ransom, and the royal administration was struggling under the weight of his enormous debt. When he died in 1199, the crown passed to his younger brother, John, a man whose reputation as a king is, to put it mildly, not great. He is, to this day, one of the most reviled monarchs in English history, a ruler whose catastrophic failures ultimately led to one of the most important legal documents in Western history. John's reign was a masterclass in political incompetence and diplomatic failure. His first major problem was his Angevin Empire. Remember that sprawling collection of lands in France that his father had so painstakingly assembled? Well,
King Philip II of France was a shrewd and ambitious ruler, and he saw John's weaknesses as an opportunity. John, through a series of military blunders and diplomatic fiascos, managed to lose nearly all of his French territories, most notably the Duchy of Normandy, which had been the heartland of the dynasty since the conquest. The loss of Normandy was a devastating blow, not just to John's prestige, but to his finances, and it forced him to turn his attention and his rapacious financial demands back to England. With his continental empire gone, John became obsessed with reconquering his lost lands. To fund his constant wars, he raised taxes to an unprecedented level. He exploited every possible feudal right, imposing a series of new and exorbitant taxes on his barons. He seized their land, demanded huge fines for minor offenses, and even took their children as hostages to ensure their loyalty. This wasn't just greed, it was a form of tyranny. He was a deeply paranoid and suspicious ruler, and his personal cruelty alienated him from nearly everyone. He famously starved his rival's wife and son to death, a gruesome act that cemented his reputation for cruelty and made the barons fear for their own lives and families. The barons, who had supported the crown through thick and thin, had finally had enough. They had lost their lands in France, they were being bled dry by John's taxes, and they were living in fear of their own king. In 1215, they formed an armed rebellion. They marched on London and forced John to a field at Runnymede, on the banks of the River Thames, where they presented him with a list of demands. Faced with a complete collapse of his authority, John was forced to sign the document they had drawn up. That document was the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely changed the relationship between the king and his subjects. Magna Carta was not a document about democracy or individual rights in the modern sense. It was a feudal document, drawn up by barons for barons, to protect their rights and privileges. It contained clauses that limited the king's power to raise taxes, protected the freedom of the church, and established that a free man could not be imprisoned or dispossessed of his land without a trial by his peers and by the law of the land. The most important clause, and the one that has echoed through history, was that the king was not above the law. He too was subject to it. It established the principle that even a monarch's power had limits, a revolutionary idea for the time. Of course, John had no intention of honoring the charter, and he immediately appealed to the Pope to have it annulled. A civil war, known as the First Barons' War, broke out. But the seed of an idea had been planted, and it would grow into something far more significant than its authors could have ever imagined. The disastrous reign of King John, therefore, led directly to a constitutional innovation that would become a cornerstone of English law, and eventually a model for legal systems around the world. The death of King John in 1216 brought his 9-year-old son, Henry III, to the throne, and with a child king at the helm, the kingdom was initially governed by a regency council. This period saw the reissue of Magna Carta, a crucial act that helped to end the First Barons' War and began to embed the charter into the fabric of English law. But as Henry came of age and began to rule in his own right, the old problems resurfaced and new ones emerged. Henry was a pious, artistic man, but he was a terrible politician. He was known for his piety and his lavish spending on grand architectural projects, most notably the rebuilding of Westminster Abbey, which he intended to be a monument to royal power and holiness. But he was also deeply unpopular with his barons, and his long reign was a constant series of conflicts. Henry's problems stemmed from a few key issues. He was incredibly dependent on his foreign favorites, particularly his wife's French relatives, who he promoted to high office and granted vast amounts of wealth and land. This alienated the English barons, who felt they were being excluded from power and patronage. He also pursued an ambitious, but ultimately disastrous foreign policy, spending huge sums of money on a failed campaign to regain his father's lost French territories.
He even accepted the Pope's offer of the throne of Sicily for his second son, Edmund, a ridiculous and costly venture that did nothing for England and only further emptied the royal treasury. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined his relationship with the English nobility. His policies were seen as both financially ruinous and a betrayal of the native nobility.
The situation came to a head in 1258. A group of powerful barons, led by the charismatic Simon de Montfort, confronted the king and forced him to accept a series of radical reforms. These reforms, known as the Provisions of Oxford, were designed to curb the king's power and give the barons a greater say in the governance of the kingdom. They called for the creation of a council of 15 barons that would supervise the king's administration, and they demanded that Parliament meet 3 times a year. This was a revolutionary step. For the first time, a group of subjects had managed to impose a written constitution on a king, limiting his power and establishing the principle of a council of advisors. Henry, of course, had no intention of abiding by these new rules. He appealed to the Pope, who conveniently annulled the provisions, and he began to reassert his authority. This led to a full-blown civil war, known as the Second Barons' War, a brutal conflict that pitted the king and his supporters against the rebellious barons. The conflict came to a head in 1264 at the Battle of Lewes, where Simon de Montfort's forces completely defeated the royal army. Henry III and his son, the future Edward III, were captured. For a little over a year, Simon de Montfort was the de facto ruler of England. He had seized power, and he now had the opportunity to implement his vision for the country. His brief time in power would prove to be a pivotal moment in the development of English government, paving the way for a more representative form of rule that was still centuries away from a true democracy, but it was a start. The stage was set for a new kind of power struggle, one not just between a king and his nobles, but between a king and a new, more representative form of government. The brief and tumultuous rule of Simon de Montfort was a revolutionary moment in English history. Having captured both King Henry III and his heir, the future Edward III, at the Battle of Lewes, Simon was, for all intents and purposes, the new king. He didn't depose Henry, but he held him captive and ruled in his name. His time in power, though short, was marked by a bold experiment in governance. Simon was a baron, and he had risen to power by leading a rebellion of his fellow nobles. But he knew that to maintain his authority, he needed a broader base of support. He needed to be more than just a feudal lord. He needed to be seen as a national leader.
To achieve this, in 1265, he did something that no one had ever done before. He summoned a new kind of assembly that historians now refer to as Simon de Montfort's Parliament. While earlier kings had held councils of nobles and bishops, Simon's Parliament was different. He summoned not just the great lords and churchmen, but also representatives from each county and from the towns, or boroughs. These representatives were known as Knights of the Shire and Burgesses.
This is a mainstream historical fact that completely changed the trajectory of English government. Simon needed these men to rubber stamp his rule, and most importantly, to vote him the taxes he needed to govern. By including them, he gave them a voice, however limited, in the affairs of the kingdom. This was the first time that commoners had been systematically included in a national assembly, a pivotal moment in the evolution of Parliament. Simon's rule, however, was a fragile thing. Many of his fellow barons were jealous of his power, and his one-time ally, the Earl of Gloucester, switched sides and allied himself with the young Prince Edward, who had managed to escape from captivity. Edward was a brilliant military commander, and he quickly raised an army. He was a ruthless and pragmatic leader, and he was determined to win back his family's throne. The two forces met at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, and it was a complete massacre. Simon de Montfort was killed in the battle, his body mutilated by his enemies, and his rebellion was crushed. The king was restored to power, and the old order was reasserted.
But the idea of a more representative parliament, however short-lived, had been born. It was an idea that could not be put back in the box. Even after his death, Simon de Montfort was seen by some as a martyr for the cause of liberty, a champion of the people against a tyrannical king. The phrase, historians still argue whether Simon de Montfort was a true patriot and reformer or simply an ambitious baron using a new political strategy to seize power, is a fun one. He might have just been a clever politician, but his actions had an unintended and lasting impact. His parliament, which had been a tool to legitimize his rule, laid the groundwork for the future of English government. When Edward I finally took the throne in 1272, he remembered the lessons of his father's reign and of Simon de Montfort's rebellion. He realized that a king needed the support of his nobles, and increasingly of the broader gentry and mercantile classes. He would go on to summon his own parliaments, and he would expand on Simon's innovation, making the inclusion of knights and burgesses a regular feature. His motivation, however, was not one of liberal-minded reform. He needed money to fund his expensive wars, and the easiest way to get it was to get the consent of the people he was taxing. The Model Parliament of 1295, as it became known, was a direct descendant of Simon's original experiment. This is a crucial step in the development of the English Constitution, and it all started with an ambitious baron who, for a brief moment, dared to give the common man a voice.
With the internal conflicts of the Second Barons' War now over, the new king, Edward III, was free to turn his attention to external threats, and his gaze fell westward towards Wales. With the internal conflicts of his father's reign settled and his own authority firmly established, Edward II could finally turn his attention to the external territories on his borders. Edward was not just a great military commander, he was a brilliant administrator and an ambitious ruler who wanted to create a single, unified Great Britain under his authority. And his first target was the mountainous and fiercely independent country of Wales. The Welsh, under their powerful leader, Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, had a long and proud history of resisting English dominance. Llywelyn had styled himself Prince of Wales and had entered into a treaty with Simon de Montfort during the Second Barons' War, which had angered the English crown. When Edward came to the throne, he was determined to bring Wales to heel, and he saw Llywelyn as a direct threat to his authority. Edward launched his first major military campaign in Wales in 1277. He didn't just rely on brute force, he used a combination of military pressure and political maneuvering. He isolated Llywelyn by winning over his brother and some of the other Welsh princes. His army, a well-organized and disciplined force, was too powerful for the Welsh to resist in a head-on battle. Llywelyn was forced to submit and was stripped of much of his territory.
He was allowed to keep the title Prince of Wales, but only as a vassal of the English king. This was a temporary solution, and the Welsh chafed under English rule. In 1282, Llywelyn, seeing an opportunity, launched a rebellion against Edward. This time, Edward was not taking any chances.
The Second Welsh Campaign, from 1282 to 1283, was a total war of conquest. Edward brought a huge army to Wales, but he also used a new strategy. He built a series of massive concentric stone castles that were both military fortresses and symbols of his power. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined his conquest of Wales. Castles like Caernarfon, Conwy, Harlech, and Beaumaris were engineering marvels of their time. They were built to be impregnable, a permanent statement of English dominance. The castles were placed in strategic locations, dominating the Welsh landscape and controlling key passes and trade routes. Llywelyn was killed in a skirmish in 1282, and with his death, the Welsh resistance crumbled. In 1284, Edward passed the Statute of Rhuddlan, which formally annexed Wales to England and established English law throughout the country.
To cement his victory, he presented his newborn son, the future Edward II, to the Welsh people as the new Prince of Wales, a title that has been held by the heir to the English throne ever since.
Edward's ambition didn't stop with Wales. He also turned his attention north to Scotland. The Scottish crown was in a succession crisis, and Edward, ever the opportunist, was invited to arbitrate the dispute. He chose John Balliol as the new Scottish king, but he forced him to swear fealty to him as his overlord. This was a direct attempt to assert his authority over Scotland, something the Scots were not happy about.
This led to a bitter, generations-long conflict that would become known as the Scottish Wars of Independence, but Edward's actions in Wales and his early maneuvering in Scotland demonstrate a clear, strategic vision. He wasn't just a king, he was a nation builder, a ruthless and efficient ruler who wanted to create a unified British kingdom.
His legacy is complex, and historians still argue whether he was a great king who brought order and stability, or a brutal tyrant who crushed the independence of his neighbors. Either way, his actions in Wales forever changed the political and cultural landscape of the British Isles. He was a man of his time, a king who believed in the absolute power of the crown, and he was more than willing to use that power to achieve his goals.
With Wales brought under English control, Edward the First was now free to turn his attention to his other great ambition, the conquest of Scotland. The Scottish crown was in a state of chaos after the death of King Alexander III in 1286, which left a young female heir, the Maid of Norway, on the throne. When she also died, a bitter succession dispute broke out, with 13 different claimants vying for the crown. The Scots, seeking a powerful arbiter, invited Edward I to settle the dispute.
Edward, ever the opportunist, seized the moment and declared himself the overlord of Scotland. He chose John Balliol as the new Scottish king, but he made it clear that Balliol was a puppet ruler, a vassal who owed him fealty. This was a direct assault on Scottish independence, and it was a humiliation that the Scottish nobility would not forget. The inevitable conflict broke out in 1296. The Scots, fed up with Edward's constant interference, allied themselves with France. Edward responded with a massive invasion. He sacked the town of Berwick-upon-Tweed, a horrific act of violence that is still a point of contention between the two nations, and defeated the main Scottish army at the Battle of Dunbar. He captured John Balliol, forced him to abdicate, and took the Scottish coronation stone, the Stone of Scone, back to England. He had, for all intents and purposes, conquered Scotland. But he was about to learn a lesson that the English would have to relearn many times over the next few centuries. You can conquer Scotland, but you can't keep it. The Scottish resistance was led by a charismatic commoner named William Wallace. Wallace, a symbol of national defiance, rallied the Scottish forces and, in a stunning upset, completely defeated an English army at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. He then went on to raid northern England, striking a major blow to English morale. Edward, furious, responded with another massive invasion. In 1298, at the Battle of Falkirk, Wallace's army, which relied on the powerful pike-wielding infantry formation known as the schiltron, was defeated by Edward's superior cavalry and longbowmen. Wallace escaped, but his power was broken. He was later captured, and in a brutal act of retribution, was executed in London in 1305, a gruesome public spectacle that was meant to crush the Scottish spirit. It didn't.
With Wallace gone, the resistance was taken up by a new figure, Robert the Bruce, a high-ranking nobleman who had a claim to the throne. He was a brilliant military strategist and a master of guerrilla warfare. He was crowned King of Scotland in 1306 and spent the next few years fighting a series of small, hit-and-run battles against the English. He was a hard man, and his struggle was a brutal one, but he was slowly winning. He was a master of using the Scottish terrain to his advantage, harassing English supply lines and avoiding a head-on confrontation with their superior armies.
Edward the Fir, the great hammer of the Scots, was growing old, and his health was failing. He died in 1307, on his way to lead yet another invasion of Scotland. His death left the war in the hands of his weak and indecisive son, Edward II, a man who was no military commander and no match for Robert the Bruce. The Scottish Wars of Independence, therefore, didn't end with a decisive English victory. They ended with a transfer of power and a new, more effective leader for the Scots. The story of Robert the Bruce would culminate in a final climactic battle that would secure Scottish independence for centuries to come, a major historical fact that completely defined the relationship between the two nations. The legacy of Edward I in Scotland, therefore, is a complicated one, a story of ambition, brutality, and ultimately, failure. He had conquered Scotland, but he couldn't hold it, and in his death, he left a problem that would haunt his successors for a very long time.
The death of Edward I in 1307 left the conquest of Scotland in the hands of his son, Edward II. If Edward I was the hammer of the Scots, then Edward II was more like a damp dishcloth of the Scots. He was a weak, indecisive king who had little interest in warfare and a deep passion for the company of his male favorites, particularly a Gascon knight named Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was a charismatic and arrogant man who Edward lavished with gifts and titles, much to the fury of his powerful barons. This conflict between the king's favorites and the rest of the nobility became the central theme of his disastrous reign and a major historical fact of the time. The barons, led by Edward's cousin, Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, repeatedly demanded that Gaveston be exiled. Edward would reluctantly agree, only to recall him as soon as he was gone. A frustrating and circular drama that weakened the king's authority.
Meanwhile, in Scotland, Robert the Bruce was steadily consolidating his power. He captured English-held castles one by one, won over the Scottish nobility, and even managed to get the Pope to recognize his claim to the throne. By 1314, only a handful of castles remained in English hands, the most important of which was Stirling Castle. Edward II, finally forced to act, led a massive army north to relieve the siege. Robert the Bruce, with a much smaller but highly disciplined and motivated force, met him at a place called Bannockburn. The battle, which took place on June 24, 1315, was a complete and utter disaster for the English. The English army, bogged down in the Scottish mud and poorly led by their indecisive king, was utterly routed. Robert the Bruce's forces achieved a stunning victory, and with it, Scotland's independence was secured for centuries to come.
This is a mainstream historical fact that is still celebrated in Scotland today, and it was a humiliation that the English would never forget.
With the Scottish problem settled, Edward II was faced with his old enemy, his own barons. The defeat at Bannockburn had completely destroyed his credibility,
and the barons, now emboldened, took control of the government. Edward was forced to accept a series of ordinances that limited his power and exiled his new favorites, the Despencer family. But the king, ever a political fool, was unable to abide by the rules. He recalled the Despensers, and a civil war broke out. Edward, with a surprisingly strong army, managed to defeat the barons and execute Thomas of Lancaster. For a brief time, it seemed like Edward had won. He and the Despensers ruled as tyrants, and their cruelty alienated the entire kingdom. But Edward's downfall would come from a different quarter. His wife, Isabella of France, had been sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, the French king. While there, she began an affair with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron who was also one of Edward's fiercest enemies. The two of them, with the support of the French court, plotted to invade England and depose the king. They landed in England in 1326 with a small army, and the country, fed up with Edward's and the Despensers' tyrannical rule, immediately rallied to their side. The king was abandoned and captured. The Despensers were executed in a brutal public spectacle. In 1327, Edward II was formally deposed, and his young son, the future Edward III, was crowned king. The deposed king was taken to Berkeley Castle and was probably murdered in a particularly gruesome manner, though the exact details are a matter of historical debate. The reign of Edward II was a tragedy, a story of a weak king, his powerful favorites, a disastrous war, and a royal family that tore itself apart. The stage was now set for a new kind of king, one who was nothing like his father. The reign of Edward III would be a complete and utter reversal of his father's failures, but his ambitions would be even greater, and his wars would be even longer. After the disastrous reign of his father, Edward III came to the throne in 1327 at the tender age of 14. For the first few years, England was ruled by his mother, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. But Edward, a precocious and ambitious young man, would not be a puppet king for long. In 1330, at the age of 17, he staged a coup, arrested Mortimer, had him executed, and sent his mother to a quiet, gilded retirement. With the regency over, Edward was finally the master of his own kingdom, and he was determined to prove himself a true warrior king, unlike his father. He was a brilliant military commander, a shrewd politician, and a patron of the arts and chivalry. His reign would be a complete and total reversal of his father's failures, but his ambition would lead him into a conflict that would last for over a century. Edward's first major challenge was the lingering conflict with Scotland. Robert the Bruce was dead, but the Scots were still a fierce and independent people. Edward, a man who saw military glory as the ultimate goal, launched a series of campaigns, and for a time, he seemed to have the upper hand. He defeated the Scots at the Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333, but he was unable to hold the country. The Scottish Wars of Independence were a lesson in futility, and Edward, ever the pragmatist, eventually turned his attention to a far more lucrative and prestigious prize, the throne of France. The story of the 100 Years' War is a complex one, a generations-long conflict that was as much a political rivalry as it was a military one. Edward's claim to the French throne was a bit tenuous, but in the tangled web of medieval dynastic claims, it was good enough. His mother, Isabella, was the daughter of the French king, Philip IV. When her brother Charles IV died without a male heir, the French nobility invoked the Salic law, which forbade inheritance through the female line, and gave the crown to his cousin Philip II. Edward, however, argued that, as the grandson of Philip IV, he had a more direct claim. In 1337, He declared himself the rightful king of France, and the war began. The early years of the war were a string of spectacular English victories that cemented Edward's reputation as a great general. The English army was a highly disciplined and professional force, and it relied on a new weapon that was proving to be devastatingly effective, the longbow. At the Battle of Crécy in 1346, a much smaller English force, using the longbow to great effect, completely annihilated a much larger French army.
The French chivalry, with its heavily armored knights, was no match for the hail of arrows that fell upon them. The victory was a massive propaganda coup for Edward and a complete humiliation for the French. It was a mainstream historical fact that completely changed the way war was fought. The age of the knightly charge was ending, and the age of the professional infantryman was beginning. A decade later, at the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, the English, under the command of Edward's eldest son Edward, the Black Prince, repeated the success of Crécy. They not only defeated the French army, but also captured the French king, John II, and a large number of his nobles. This was a stunning victory that brought the French monarchy to its knees. The war, however, would not be settled by a single battle. It would be a long, drawn-out affair, a series of raids and counter-raids that would devastate the French countryside and drain the English treasury. But for a time, at least, the English were masters of the battlefield, and their reputation for military prowess was second to none. The longbow, a weapon of devastating simplicity, had made the English army the most feared fighting force in Europe. The war, however, would soon be overshadowed by a much bigger, much more terrifying enemy, one that couldn't be defeated with a bow or a sword. The great battles of Crécy and Poitiers had brought England immense prestige and wealth, but they were about to be overshadowed by a silent and terrifying enemy. In the year 1348, a devastating pandemic, the Black Death, arrived in England. It was a plague of biblical proportions, a disease that spread with shocking speed and killed with a brutal efficiency.
It was carried by fleas on rats, and it swept across the European continent before arriving on England's shores, likely in a trading ship docking in a port like Melcombe Regis in Dorset. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely reshaped English society, culture, and economy.
The plague manifested in three forms: the bubonic form, which caused the painful swellings, or buboes, that gave the disease its name; the pneumonic form, which attacked the lungs and was spread through coughing; and the septicemic form, which infected the blood and was almost always fatal. The symptoms were horrific: fever, vomiting, and a rapid, agonizing death. There was no cure, no understanding of how it spread, and no way to stop it.
The medical knowledge of the time was completely helpless. Doctors and priests, trying to help the sick, often became victims themselves.
The impact of the Black Death on England was catastrophic. In just a few years, it wiped out an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. Imagine a country where half the people you know, your family, your friends, your neighbors, are suddenly gone. The fields lay fallow, the villages were abandoned, and the cities were filled with the stench of death. The sheer scale of the mortality was a psychological shock that shattered the social fabric. People reacted in a variety of ways. Some turned to religious extremism, believing the plague was God's punishment. Others embraced a hedonistic lifestyle, believing that every day could be their last. The cemeteries were so full that new mass burial pits had to be dug, and the church, with its constant funerals and death tolls, was completely overwhelmed.
But the Black Death, for all its horror, had a surprising and lasting effect on the English economy and social structure. With so many people dead, there was a severe labor shortage. Before the plague, there had been an abundance of peasant farmers, or serfs, who were tied to the land and had to work for their lord. Now, suddenly, the few surviving laborers were in high demand. They could, for the first time, demand higher wages and better working conditions.
They could even leave their lord's manor and go work for someone who offered a better deal. This newfound freedom and economic power was a revolutionary change. The ruling class, of course, was not happy about this. They tried to resist the changes. King Edward III passed the Statute of Laborers in 1351, which attempted to fix wages at pre-plague levels and made it illegal for peasants to move. But the law was unenforceable. The economic forces of supply and demand were far more powerful than any king's edict. The feudal system, which had been the basis of English society for centuries, began to crumble. Serfdom, the institution that tied a peasant to the land, slowly began to die out. This is where a light joke comes in, you know. It's a bit like an early version of the free market, except instead of a CEO demanding a pay cut, it was a baron demanding a serf's stay on his land, and the serf just said, "Nope, I'm off to a different manor, where the air smells a little less plaguey."
The Black Death, therefore, was not just a medical disaster, it was a social and economic revolution. It empowered the common people and led to a profound shift in the balance of power between the lords and the peasants. It was a catalyst for change, a terrible event that ultimately set the stage for a new kind of society, one in which the common man had more freedom and a greater say in his own destiny.
And this newfound confidence and sense of self-worth would soon lead to an open, armed rebellion against the very laws designed to keep them down. The Black Death had shattered the feudal system and given the common people a taste of economic power they had never known. But with that power came new burdens and a new kind of resentment. King Edward III's attempt to fix wages and prevent peasants from moving, while largely a failure, was a symbol of the nobility's unwillingness to accept the new reality. And with the 100 Years' War against France still dragging on, the king needed more and more money to pay for his armies.
This led to a new and deeply unpopular tax known as the poll tax, which was levied on every person in the kingdom, regardless of their wealth. It was a regressive tax that hit the poorest people the hardest, and it was the final straw. This is a mainstream historical fact that directly led to one of the most significant popular uprisings in all of English history.
In 1381, a revolt broke out in Essex and Kent, and it quickly spread across the country. The leaders were charismatic commoners like Wat Tyler, a former soldier, and a radical priest named John Ball, who famously preached that when Adam delved and Eve span, there was no gentleman. His sermons were a powerful indictment of the social hierarchy, a call for a new world where all men were equal. The peasants, armed with farm implements and a burning sense of injustice, marched on London.
They were a massive, disorganized, but highly motivated force, and they had a clear set of demands: the abolition of serfdom, the repeal of the poll tax, and a new government that would protect the rights of the common man. The king at the time was the young Richard II, a mere 14 years old. He was a brave but naive ruler who was left to face the rebellion with very little support from his panicked and scattered court. He famously rode out to meet the rebels at Mile End and agreed to their demands. He promised to abolish serfdom and pardon all the rebels, a clever bit of political theater that temporarily diffused the situation. But the rebels, still in London and now emboldened, were not done.
A smaller, more radical group, led by Wat Tyler, confronted the king a second time at Smithfield. The meeting was tense. Wat Tyler, in a moment of hubris, was killed by the mayor of London, William Walworth. The rebels, seeing their leader fall, were on the verge of a riot. It was at this moment that the young Richard II showed a flash of brilliance. He rode out in front of the crowd and famously declared, "I am your captain, and I will be your leader." It was a bold and audacious move that saved the day. The rebels, leaderless and confused, slowly dispersed. The revolt was over.
But the king's promises were empty. Once the peasants had returned to their homes, Richard II and his advisors brutally crushed the remaining pockets of rebellion. The leaders were hunted down and executed, and the promises of reform were all but forgotten. The peasants' revolt was, from a military standpoint, a complete failure. But from a social and historical standpoint, it was a profound success.
It showed the English nobility that the common people were not just a faceless mass to be exploited. They had a voice, and they were willing to fight and die for their rights. The memory of the revolt lingered, and the feudal system, though not officially abolished, continued its slow, inexorable decline. Historians still argue whether the revolt was a spontaneous uprising or a more organized movement with clear political goals. Either way, it was a turning point. It marked a new era in which the common man, empowered by the economic changes of the Black Death, would play a more active role in the political life of the kingdom.
It was a prelude to the constitutional crises that would plague the rest of Richard II's reign. As a young king who had faced down a mob with a mix of bravery and deceit, would grow into an autocratic and deeply unpopular ruler, setting the stage for his own dramatic downfall. The young Richard II, who had so bravely faced down the peasants' revolt, grew into a very different kind of king. As he came of age, he developed an autocratic and deeply unpopular style of rule. He was a man who believed in the absolute power of the monarch, a concept that put him on a collision course with his powerful nobility. He saw himself as above the law, and believed that his word alone should be enough to govern the kingdom.
This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined his reign and led to his eventual downfall. His belief in royal absolutism was a direct affront to the constitutional principles that had been slowly developing since Magna Carta, a fact his barons would not ignore. Richard's reign was marked by constant conflict with his uncles and other powerful magnates, a group known as the Lords Appellant, who sought to limit the king's power and control his government. This was an ongoing power struggle, a bitter feud between a king who wanted total control and a nobility that was determined to have its voice heard. In 1388, the Lords Appellant, with a powerful army, defeated the king's favorites and took control of the government, forcing Richard to submit to their will. It was a complete humiliation, but the young king, ever the political schemer, was just biding his time. He was forced to rule with a council of his enemies for a few years, but in 1389 he declared himself of age and began to slowly and methodically reassert his authority.
For the next 8 years, Richard ruled with a surprising degree of peace and stability. He married a child bride, Isabella of Valois, which created a peaceful relationship with France, and he began to rebuild his power base. He was a patron of the arts and a lover of courtly life. But beneath the surface, he was still a deeply resentful and vindictive man. He never forgot the humiliation of the Lords Appellant, and in 1397 he finally got his revenge. He arrested his former enemies, had them executed or exiled, and began to rule without any opposition. He became a tyrant, a king who was paranoid and vengeful. He raised taxes without the consent of Parliament, a direct violation of the principles of Magna Carta. He seized the land of his exiled opponents, an act that terrified his barons, who feared that their own property was no longer safe. The final straw came in 1399 when Richard II exiled his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, the son of the powerful John of Gaunt. When John of Gaunt died, Richard seized his vast landholdings and declared Henry's inheritance forfeit. This was a catastrophic mistake. Henry Bolingbroke was a popular and powerful nobleman, and his family, the House of Lancaster, was one of the most influential in the kingdom.
With a legitimate claim to his father's lands and a burning sense of injustice, Henry returned from exile to reclaim his inheritance. The country, fed up with Richard's tyranny, immediately rallied to his side. Richard was in Ireland at the time, and when he returned, he found that his army had abandoned him. He was captured, and the end was swift. In September 1399, Richard II was formally deposed by a parliament that had been summoned by Henry. He was accused of a long list of crimes, including tyranny and a violation of his coronation oath. Henry Bolingbroke, with the support of the nobility, was crowned King Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle and was probably murdered, though the exact circumstances of his death are still debated. The downfall of Richard II was a pivotal moment in English history. It was the first time an English monarch had been deposed by a powerful nobleman, and it set a dangerous precedent. The crown, which had been so hard won and so jealously guarded, was now seen as something that could be taken by force. The stage was set for a new kind of dynastic conflict, one that would tear the kingdom apart for generations. The deposition of Richard II and the coronation of Henry IV in 1399 marked the beginning of a new and deeply unstable royal dynasty. The House of Lancaster, now on the throne, had a problem. Henry IV had seized power by force, a precedent that was both dangerous and difficult to overcome. He was not a king by right of birth, but by right of conquest, and many of the old nobility, while happy to see the back of Richard II, were not so sure about his successor. The first half of his reign was a constant battle against rebellions and conspiracies. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined his time as king. He was constantly fighting to legitimize his rule and to put down challenges to his authority, both from the supporters of the deposed Richard and from powerful nobles who believed they had a better claim to the throne. The most famous of these rebellions was led by the Percy family, a powerful and influential noble house from the north of England. The Percys, who had initially been Henry's staunchest allies, felt that the king had not rewarded them sufficiently for their support. They joined forces with Owain Glyndwr, a Welsh nobleman who had launched a massive rebellion against English rule in Wales and with the Scots. The combined rebellion was a serious threat to Henry's throne. It culminated in the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, a bloody and brutal affair where Henry, along with his young son, the future Henry V, defeated the rebels. The battle was a decisive victory for the king, but it was a testament to the fact that his rule was still far from secure. Henry's reign was also plagued by a lack of money. The long wars with France and the constant rebellions had emptied the royal treasury. He was forced to constantly ask Parliament for money, which gave them more power and influence. He was a king who was in a constant state of debt and was therefore more reliant on the goodwill of his nobles and the commons than his predecessors. The Parliament that had helped put him on the throne was now a powerful check on his authority, a new and important dynamic in the relationship between the crown and the government. Henry IV's health failed him in his later years, and he became a recluse, leaving the day-to-day governance to his son, the Prince of Wales, who was a very different kind of man. Henry, in a classic historical debate, was a king who ruled with a heavy hand, but he was also a man who had to constantly fight to maintain his power. Historians still argue whether his reign was a necessary period of consolidation after the tyranny of Richard II, or if it was a period of dangerous instability that sowed the seeds for a future dynastic conflict. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but he was also a king who was constantly looking over his shoulder. He died in 1413, a tired and broken man, and the throne passed to his son, Henry V. The new king was a brilliant and charismatic figure who would, for a brief time, restore the prestige of the English monarchy. He would prove himself to be one of the greatest military commanders in English history, and would, for a time, completely reverse the failures of the previous century. He would take the lessons of his father's tumultuous reign and use them to unite the country in a new and incredibly ambitious war with France. The stage was set for a new kind of kingship, one that would be defined by military glory and a sense of national purpose. The long, bloody saga of the House of Lancaster was just beginning. The reign of Henry VI, 1413 to 1422, was a dramatic reversal of his father's tumultuous rule. Unlike Henry IV, who spent his time fighting to secure his throne, Henry V was a charismatic and brilliant military leader who was able to unite the English nobility behind a single ambitious goal: the conquest of France. He was a ruthless pragmatist, a man who had put his wild youth behind him and was now completely focused on his duty as king. He had learned from the rebellions of his father's reign that a king needed the support of his people, and he knew that nothing united a country like a successful foreign war. So, he dusted off his great-grandfather Edward III's claim to the French throne and prepared for an invasion. The war that followed was a complete and utter triumph for Henry V. He was a master of siege warfare and a brilliant battlefield commander. In 1415, he launched his first invasion of France, and after a difficult siege of the town of Harfleur, he found his army was depleted by disease and had to march across a hostile country to reach the safety of English-held Calais. But the French, with a much larger army, intercepted him at a place called Agincourt. The battle, fought on October 25, 1415, was a complete and total English victory, a major historical fact that cemented Henry V's reputation as a military genius and remains one of the most famous battles in all of English history. The French army, which was a mix of heavily armored knights and a new, more professional army, was bogged down in a muddy field. The English army, with its superior longbowmen, rained down a deadly hail of arrows on the French forces. The English archers were protected by stakes they had sharpened and driven into the ground, a simple but effective defense against cavalry charges. The French knights, in their heavy armor, were an easy target. The battle was a massacre, a complete humiliation for the French nobility, and a massive propaganda victory for the English. Henry V had not only won a stunning victory against impossible odds, but he had also captured a number of high-ranking French nobles who were now his hostages. Following Agincourt, Henry V continued his campaign of conquest. He didn't just win battles, he conquered and held territory. He was a master of diplomacy as well as war, and in 1420, he forced the French to sign the Treaty of Troyes. This treaty was a diplomatic masterpiece, a complete and total capitulation by the French. Under its terms, Henry V married the French king's daughter, Catherine, and was recognized as the heir to the French throne, disinheriting the French king's own son, the Dauphin. It was a stunning achievement. For a brief time, it seemed as though Henry V was on the verge of creating a dual monarchy, a single kingdom ruled by an English king that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees.
But history, as we know, is a bit of a trickster. Henry Lefebvre, in his moment of greatest triumph, died in 1422 from dysentery, a disease that was a constant and deadly companion of medieval armies. His infant son, Henry VI, was crowned king of both England and France. Henry IV's reign, though short, was a golden age for the English monarchy, a period of immense military glory and national pride. But his death left a child on the throne, a weak and pious boy who was completely incapable of holding on to the vast empire his father had so brilliantly won. The long, slow decline of English power in France was about to begin, and it would, in turn, lead to a new kind of civil war in England, one that would tear the country apart for generations. With the death of Henry V, the vast Angevin empire he had so brilliantly won in France was left in the hands of an infant king, Henry VI. His minority, from 1422 to 1437, was a period of constant struggle, with powerful English noblemen vying for control of the Regency Council. These internal divisions, combined with a fierce resurgence of French nationalism, spelled disaster for the English possessions on the continent. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined the first half of Henry VI's reign. The English, under a series of capable but often bickering generals, were still able to hold on to a significant amount of French territory, but the momentum had shifted. The French, now with a new sense of national purpose, were fighting for their home, while the English were fighting an expensive and increasingly unpopular foreign war. The turning point came with the appearance of a young peasant girl named Joan of Arc. She was a charismatic and deeply pious figure who claimed to have been sent by God to drive the English out of France and to see the French king, the Dauphin Charles, crowned at Reims. Her story is one of the most remarkable in all of history. She rallied the demoralized French army, lifted the siege of the strategically important city of Orléans in 1429, and led a string of stunning victories against the English. Her presence on the battlefield, a symbol of divine providence, was a massive psychological boost for the French and a complete demoralization for the English. She was a simple girl from the countryside who had suddenly become the greatest military leader in France, a fact that both terrified and fascinated the English. The English, desperate to stop her, captured Joan in 1430. She was put on trial by an ecclesiastical court controlled by the English and was accused of heresy and witchcraft. The trial was a farce, a politically motivated show trial designed to discredit her and break the French morale. She was found guilty and, in 1431, was burned at the stake. But her death didn't break the French spirit. It only made her a martyr. The French, now with a powerful symbol of their resistance, continued to fight. The English position in France slowly but surely began to crumble. The Duke of Burgundy, a powerful French nobleman who had been allied with the English, switched sides in 1435, a devastating blow to the English war effort. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely turned the tide of the war. With the Burgundians now fighting against them, the English were on the defensive. The French, under the new King Charles VII, began to systematically reconquer their lost territories. The English, with an increasingly unstable king and a war-weary population, were unable to stop them. Henry VI, as he came of age, proved to be a deeply unsuitable king. He was a kind, gentle, and deeply pious man, but he was also weak and indecisive, and he was prone to bouts of mental illness. He was completely dominated by his powerful and ambitious wife, Margaret of Anjou, and by a circle of her favorites. The loss of France, which culminated in the final English defeat at the Battle of Castillon in 1453, was a complete humiliation. The once vast Angevin Empire
which had stretched across a significant portion of France, was now reduced to a single small town, Calais. The 100 Years' War was over, and England had lost. This was a catastrophic blow to the prestige of the monarchy, and it created a power vacuum that would soon be filled by a new kind of conflict. The stage was set for a civil war, a bitter dynastic struggle for the throne itself, one that would pit the king against his own powerful cousin and would tear the country apart for generations. The loss of France was a catastrophic blow to the prestige of the English crown and a major cause of the dynastic conflict that would follow. With the 100 Years' War over and a weak, mentally unstable king on the throne, the powerful nobles, who had spent decades fighting a foreign war, now turned on each other. The old animosities and personal rivalries that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. The stage was set for the Wars of the Roses, a bitter and bloody civil war that would pit two rival branches of the royal family, the houses of Lancaster and York, against each other in a struggle for the throne. The House of Lancaster was represented by the King, Henry VI, and his powerful and ambitious queen, Margaret of Anjou. Their symbol was a red rose. The House of York was represented by Richard, Duke of York, a powerful and popular nobleman who had a strong claim to the throne through his mother's lineage. His symbol was a white rose. The conflict was a long, complex, and often confusing affair, with alliances shifting and battles being fought across the country. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined the latter half of the 15th century. It wasn't a constant large-scale war, but a series of short, brutal campaigns punctuated by periods of uneasy peace. The conflict officially began in 1455 with the First Battle of St. Albans. The battle was a decisive victory for the Yorkists, and the king was captured. Richard of York, however, didn't depose the king. He was too popular, and the idea of deposing a king was still a radical one. Instead, he forced Henry VI to accept him as his protector and heir to the throne, effectively disinheriting the king's own son. This was a temporary solution, and the queen, Margaret of Anjou, who was a formidable political figure in her own right, was not about to let her son be disinherited. She raised an army, and in 1460, at the Battle of Wakefield, the Lancastrians won a major victory. Richard of York was killed in the battle, and his head was displayed on the walls of York, adorned with a paper crown in mockery of his ambition. But the death of Richard of York didn't end the conflict. It only intensified it. The Yorkist cause was now taken up by his popular and charismatic son, Edward, Earl of March, the future Edward IV. He was a brilliant military commander and a handsome, popular nobleman who was the complete opposite of the weak and ineffectual Henry VI. He was a man who was destined for greatness. He led the Yorkist forces to a series of stunning victories, most notably at the Battle of Towton in 1461, which was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. With the Lancastrian forces defeated and King Henry VI now a fugitive, Edward was crowned king. The Wars of the Roses were a brutal and unforgiving conflict. The fighting was often personal, with key figures being executed after battles, a sharp departure from the more chivalric warfare of the 100 Years' War. The great noble families of England were torn apart by the conflict, and a new, more ruthless generation of leaders emerged. The old feudal ties were breaking down, and a new kind of power was emerging, one based not on ancient claims, but on military success and political cunning. The stage was now set for the next chapter of this brutal saga, one that would see the Yorkists in power and the Lancastrians in exile. But the New Yorkist dynasty was not destined for a peaceful reign.
and the ghosts of the past would soon come back to haunt them.
The triumph of the House of York, led by the charismatic Edward III, seemed to signal an end to the Wars of the Roses, at least for a while. Edward was crowned king in 1461, and for the next decade he ruled with a surprising degree of peace and stability. He was a popular and effective king, a man who had won his crown on the battlefield and who was now determined to hold on to it through a combination of political skill and military strength.
He was a master of propaganda, using his good looks and charm to win over the London merchants and a population that was tired of the constant warfare. He was also a shrewd businessman, and he took a keen interest in the kingdom's finances, helping to stabilize the royal treasury and make the government more effective.
However, Edward's reign was not without its problems. His most powerful ally, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, a man known as the Kingmaker for his role in putting Edward on the throne, grew increasingly resentful of the king's independence. Their relationship was a classic medieval power struggle, a clash of two massive egos that would eventually tear the Yorkist dynasty apart. The breaking point came over Edward's marriage.
Warwick had been negotiating a marriage alliance for Edward with the French royal family, a move that would have brought peace with France and cemented their alliance. But Edward, secretly and without his knowledge, married a commoner, Elizabeth Woodville, a beautiful widow whose family was of the lesser nobility. This was a stunning and deeply unpopular move that completely humiliated Warwick and turned him into an enemy of the king.
In 1469, Warwick, in a rage, launched a rebellion. He captured Edward IV and briefly installed the mentally unstable Henry VI back on the throne, a truly bizarre turn of events. But the Lancastrian cause was a dead one. The country was not about to go back to the chaos of Henry VI's rule. The Yorkist forces rallied, and Edward IV, after a brief exile, returned to England with a new army and a renewed determination.
He defeated Warwick at the Battle of Barnet in 1471, where the Kingmaker was killed in the fighting. He then went on to defeat the last of the Lancastrian forces at the Battle of Tewkesbury, where Henry II's son, Edward of Westminster, was killed. With the Lancastrian line all but extinguished, and Queen Margaret of Anjou now a prisoner, Edward IV was finally the undisputed king. He had won his crown, lost it, and won it back again. A truly remarkable story of survival and triumph.
The last 12 years of Edward IV's reign were a period of relative peace and prosperity. He was a king who was able to provide the stability that the country so desperately craved. He managed to secure a long truce with France, which brought in a much-needed pension, and he was able to rule without the constant threat of rebellion. He was a king who had learned from his mistakes and had grown into a masterful and effective ruler.
This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined his second period on the throne. He was a man who had brought a measure of stability to a country that had been torn apart by civil war for decades. But the peace was a fragile thing, and it was about to be shattered by a new kind of power struggle, one that would come from within the royal family itself. The death of Edward IV in 1483, at the age of 40, was a completely unexpected event, and it created a power vacuum that would lead to the most infamous episode of the Wars of the Roses.
The stage was set for a new kind of drama, one that involved a king's brother, two young princes, and a reputation that would be forever stained by a heinous crime. The Wars of the Roses were not over yet, and the final act was about to be the most dramatic of all.
The unexpected death of Edward IV in 1483, at the age of 40, plunged England into a political crisis that would bring the Wars of the Roses to their dramatic and bloody conclusion. The new king was Edward's young son, a boy of 12, who was crowned Edward V, but his reign was to be one of the shortest and most tragic in English history. The young king was immediately put under the protection of his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, a powerful and ambitious nobleman who had been his father's most loyal supporter. Richard was named Lord Protector of the realm, and he quickly moved to consolidate his power. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined the power struggle that followed.
Richard, a brilliant military commander and a shrewd politician, was also a man who was deeply suspicious of the Woodville family, his brothers-in-laws, who he saw as a threat to his own authority. He moved quickly and ruthlessly. He arrested the young king's maternal uncle and other key Woodville supporters, had them executed, and sent the young king and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, to the Tower of London for their protection. The boys who became known as the princes in the Tower were never seen again. This is where a light joke comes in, you know? It's a bit like a medieval version of going to live on a farm, except the farm was a very big, very spooky stone fortress with a lot of guards.
With the young king and his brother out of the way, Richard moved to seize the throne for himself. He claimed that his brother's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid and that their children were therefore illegitimate. A parliament, which he had packed with his supporters, quickly agreed, and in 1483, Richard was crowned King Richard III. His reign was short, lasting just over 2 years, but it was a period of intense political paranoia and constant threats to his power. He was a king who was seen by many as a usurper, a man who had stolen the throne from his young nephews, and he knew it. He spent his time trying to legitimize his rule, but the rumors of the prince's murder, whether true or not, haunted him. The princes were an inconvenient truth for his reign, but they also created a new and powerful enemy for him, the Lancastrian cause.
The Lancastrian cause was, for all intents and purposes, dead. But the tyrannical and unpopular rule of Richard III gave it a new hope. The Lancastrian claim had passed to a nobleman named Henry Tudor, who had a very tenuous claim to the throne through a female line. He was in exile in France, but he had the support of many of the old Lancastrian families, and most importantly, of those Yorkists who had become disillusioned with Richard III. They saw him as their only hope for a peaceful and stable kingdom. This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined the final act of the Wars of the Roses. In 1485, Henry Tudor, with a small army of English exiles and French mercenaries, landed in Wales. He marched towards England, gathering support as he went. Richard III, a brilliant and experienced military commander, met him at a place called Bosworth Field. It was a final desperate battle for the throne, a clash of two very different men with two very different claims to power. The outcome of that battle would not just decide the fate of the two men, but the fate of the entire country. The Wars of the Roses, a brutal and chaotic period of civil war, were about to come to a definitive end, and a new dynasty would be born. The reign of Richard III was a brief and controversial one, but it was a necessary bridge between two eras, the end of the medieval world and the beginning of a new one. The final act of the Wars of the Roses took place on a field in Leicestershire, a place called Bosworth Field, on August 22, 1485. The battle pitted the forces of King Richard III, a man who had seized the throne and was now fighting to hold on to it, against the army of Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant who had arrived in England with a small force and a lot of ambition.
This is a mainstream historical fact that completely defined the end of the medieval period in England and the beginning of a new one. Richard III was an experienced and brilliant military commander. He had a larger army and was the anointed king. Henry Tudor, on the other hand, was an untested leader who had spent most of his life in exile. On paper, it should have been an easy victory for Richard, but a combination of shifting loyalties and strategic blunders would lead to his dramatic and final defeat.
The battle itself was a short and brutal affair. Richard, in a desperate attempt to end the conflict quickly, launched a cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor. He was a brave warrior, a man who was fighting for his throne, and his last moments were a testament to his ferocity. He unhorsed Henry's standard-bearer and was just a few feet away from killing the Lancastrian claimant himself. But at that crucial moment, a key ally of Richard, Sir William Stanley, whose forces had been sitting on the sidelines, suddenly charged into the battle, but not on Richard's side. He and his brother, Thomas Stanley, had been waiting to see which way the wind was blowing, and they had chosen to support Henry. Their intervention completely turned the tide of the battle. Richard was surrounded. He fought to the last, but he was eventually killed. A king dying on the battlefield, a fate that had been rare in English history since the Norman Conquest. He was the last English king to die in battle. With Richard III dead, his crown was famously found in a hawthorn bush and was placed on the head of Henry Tudor. He was now King Henry VII, and his reign would mark the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, a new era in English history. Henry, a shrewd and pragmatic ruler, knew that his claim to the throne was not the strongest. He was a Lancastrian, but he also needed to unite the country and end the Wars of the Roses for good. He did this with a brilliant act of political maneuvering. He married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of the Yorkist king Edward the Thor, a move that symbolically united the two warring houses and ended the dynastic conflict. The Tudor rose, a combination of the red and white roses, became the new symbol of the kingdom, a visual representation of a new unified England.
The Battle of Bosworth Field was more than just the end of a king or the end of a war. It was the end of an era. The medieval world, with its constant chivalric warfare, its powerful and independent nobility, and its dynastic squabbles, was coming to a close. Henry VII, a king who had won his crown on the battlefield, would spend the rest of his reign consolidating his power, crushing any remaining rebellions, and creating a new, more centralized form of government. He was a king who ruled with an iron fist, but he brought a new sense of stability to a country that had been torn apart by war for decades. His reign and the Tudor dynasty that followed would usher in the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Exploration, a complete and total break from the medieval past. The long, complex, and often bloody story of medieval England had finally come to an end.
Now, as our journey through this fascinating and often brutal period comes to a close, you can begin to relax. The last clanging of swords on shields has faded, and the sounds of the great halls and bustling towns have finally quieted. The long winding story of medieval England, with its brave kings and tragic queens, its great battles and quiet moments, is now complete. The sun is setting on this world of castles and peasants, of knights and cathedrals, and as the darkness settles in, you can feel the weight of history begin to lift. The great figures we have met, from Alfred the Great to Henry the Fifth, from William the Conqueror to Richard III, are now just ghosts in the pages of our shared past. Their struggles and their triumphs are now just echoes, distant sounds in the long, unending river of time. the grand tapestry of their lives, woven with threads of power, ambition, and fate, can finally be put to rest. So, as you lie here, listen to the quiet of the night. The stories are over, the wars are done, and the long, long road of history has led us here. There is nothing left to do but drift off to sleep, a peaceful and well-deserved rest. The dreams that will find you tonight will be of a new world, one that is just beginning to take shape. And in that new world, you can rest assured that for tonight, at least, the fighting is over.